Welcome to week 9. Let's see, wow, 2 weeks to go. 4 classes and a final. I'll get your midterms back to you this week. Plus, let's see, class evaluations. Those of you on online world, I'm not sure how they make that arrangement for you, for the online evaluation. But I'd say the best evaluation is to take the class again, so that, and definitely enrollment has opened, and so far there's only 2 to 7 people enrolled, depending on the section, I think. Yes, so good. All right, so I want to focus on a little bit on in Asante by starting off with Great Zimbabwe as an exemplar. Can you go to slide, please? So if you notice this city, or the stone-walled enclosure, there were a bunch of them. And this is where under the British colony, which we haven't actually gotten to this part in time yet, but the British colony Rhodesia, after Sir Cecil Rhodes, which his endowment basically created the Rhodes Scholarship. A great colonialist, if you want to consider great and colonialist in the same sentence. So, Great Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe in the Shona language, Shona, Indibeles, and a couple other tribal groups make up Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe in Shona means place of stone houses. So there are 300 plus of these stone houses in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, because, obviously, just like in the United States, where nature doesn't really plot in straight lines, so to create straight lines in states, in terms of borders, artificially drawing borders, the idea behind, who occupies what country doesn't necessarily follow along linear lines, but these stone houses basically was Great Zimbabwe is the largest, thriving from mostly the 11th to the 15th century, i.e. 10s to 1400s in our calendar. So with these cities there was trade with India and China. The king lived in the great enclosure with his wives, plural, gold, silver, and bronze, eating from plates imported from Persia and China. So when we talk about China, that means basically ceramic plates. 12,000 people lived in it around 1400, making it one of the largest cities in Africa. So when you think about what it takes to live in one particular place, being ecologically balanced, not using water, not pooping in your drinking water, having a degree of social organization that we haven't really talked about in depth, other than to kind of glance over the large places. Again, this is talking about a city, which is how we in the West kind of define civilization, living in a large group of folks. So this was a center for trade, and therefore a target for Europeans, particularly the Portuguese. In Asante, page 158 to 165, some of the Yoruba values, tribal values. The Yoruba are a large tribal group in what is now known as Nigeria. There is one supreme God. Only 2 days are certain, birth and death. All others can be foreseen and changed, forecast and changed. So you are born with a specific destiny or path in your life. Your spirit lives after death and can reincarnate through blood relatives. Divination is the instrument that will reveal your path. So when they're talking about divination, and I, let's see, don't have the slides that actually support Yoruba divination, but it is, dare I go here? Yes, I will. Go here. So, string theory. I don't know if you can see this. String theory basically says that there's 11 dimensions of space-time. This is the science that essentially generates the your cell phones, quantum physics. So when Ronald Reagan and others talk about voodoo economics, they're talking about a concept in which it's like witchcraft. Now, I think of what I call it as n-dimensional forces. And it goes like this. First dimension is length. Second dimension, you square the line, length and width. Third dimension, length, width, and depth. Fourth dimension, space, time. So it's not just linear time, past, present, future, on one timeline. It's also circular time. It's also a spiral view of time. It could also be the dream time, in which all possible times are present and accessible. So Einstein and those quantum physics cats that invented the basic science that run your cell phone, Einstein himself said, past, present, and future are stubborn illusions, but we operate outside them. But we are basically, it's an illusion that, you know, you go to sleep and then you wake up and it's the next day, or some time has passed, just like when you go to sleep in the dream world and you're in a dream world and it seems real to you. You know, there's some psychologists, early psychologists, contemporary with Jung and Freud, that basically said, well, it is a reality. You're there. You're just not physically there. And it's real. So my idea is, which is basically talking about n-dimensional forces. So string theory works by basically starting with 11 dimensions of space-time. So I'm drawing them out as far as I can with my limited ability to put it on a whiteboard. And the reason I started off on the whole Yoruba thing is they're talking about divination, okay? The only two dates that are set in your life are birth and death, period. Which means, oh, they're set before you're born in that worldview. So you can change or forecast what's going to happen by what I don't mean to be woo-woo about this, but there are n-dimensional forces. So the idea behind n dimensions. So 11 dimensions of space-time. So when I first saw that as a Scientific America article in 1983, I consulted a theoretical physicist who said, oh, it's actually 48, but wait, 48 dimensions? What are you talking about? Why does it say 11 if they're 48? Well, nobody would believe 48. And I said, well, I'm having trouble with 11, so what are they? So he started breaking them down. Right? First, the line. Second, the square. Third, the cube. Fourth, you could basically call a tesseract or a hypercube, which basically like a cube within a cube, except that, drawing that, I could actually draw that, do have graphics for it, but that was another lecture. So fifth dimension, besides the 60s soul group. Electromagnetism. And I said, how is that a dimension? He said, well, wherever there's an electronic field, there's a magnetic field, and you can use magnetism to generate electricity. What if they were the same thing viewed from our point of view? And I said, explain that some more, I'm not getting that. He said, okay, suppose you're a point in these configurations. All you could see as a point is other points. You couldn't see a line. You could just see the points on either side of you. Maybe other points on other lines, but you can only see points, not lines. If you're a line, you can see points and lines, but not squares. If you're a square, you can see points, lines, and other squares, but not cubes. And then so on, right? So what appears to be one united phenomenon, electromagnetism, is a higher order dimension. Okay, I think I'm starting to follow this. So what's the sixth dimension? Strong nuclear force. The force that holds atoms together. Split the atom, boom. Dimension 7. Weak nuclear force. Radiation. Okay, so we got now 1 through 7. Got that. What about 8? Oh, that's subatomic. What? Wait. Strong nuclear force, stronger than in its area than gravity. Gravity is yet another one, right? Or one of those universal forces. So, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force. Dimensions 8, 9, 10, and 11 are all subatomic, involving quarks and muons and all kinds of particles you can only see in a particle chamber, which when this particular person was doing experimentation at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, what they were finding is they would think about a particle a week, and a week later they would discover it. So was the particle actually there before they thought about it, or are they thinking it into existence? That's one of those Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But anyway, the basic science was basically what runs your cell phone. Sounds crazy, but okay. So he said, as the capper, human beings, in order to manipulate these forces, have to be in dimensions above them to utilize nuclear force or cell phones. Okay, that makes sense given, right? So we're beyond, okay, got it. N-dimensional forces, that's what I'm saying. Okay, how many dimensions? If you need 11 dimensions to get string theory, cell phones, etc., and he's saying that there's 48, that he's identified, or he and his colleagues, as quantum theoretical physicists. 48 dimensions? So you've narrowed it down to 11? Okay, that's beyond me. But I do note that ancient cultures believe that you can manipulate, human beings can manipulate what seem to be invisible forces. Certainly electromagnetism is an invisible force. Your cell phone signal is an invisible force. Okay, that's subject to manipulation, but it's as real as, well, it's not solid like the table, but it's a real measurable force. So, we haven't discovered life force yet.
Light or life?
Life. Okay, what animates our bodies? We don't know what that is. We know, according to the movies, 21 grams, there is a 21-gram weight loss that happens at the moment of death. That's not air. That's not liquid. Well, what is it? Because in our theoretical physics, energy has no mass. So wait, this is almost an ounce between life and death. What is the force that animates the body that exerts a gravitational force of around 21 grams? Well, we don't know what that is yet, right? So, n-dimensional forces. we haven't basically been able to identify, the soul or whatever, right? But there are cultures of tradition that believe they can and basically can manipulate them. Back to slide thing, please. So if you're born with a specific destiny or path, your spirit lives after death and can reincarnate through blood relatives. Divination is the instrument that will reveal your path. So our ancestors must be honored, respected, consulted, and you must never harm another human being or the universe because they are you. Sacrifice is necessary to assure spiritual success. So sacrifice not in the terms of just simply killing a chicken or a goat or whatever, but also, putting others before yourself. All realms of our existence must work together and be balanced. And character is the greatest trait of the human being. So these are often, you can see, even though this is a religion or a spiritual path that predates the Abrahamics, it has some universal as well as unique characteristics in terms of other forms of spirituality. Coolness is the ultimate goal of character. There's more on that later, but you can reference a book by Robert Farris Thompson called Flash of the Spirit, in which he talks about the concept of coolness among the Yoruba, which is a concept echoed within jazz, the birth of the cool, as well as in hip-hop too, cool, chill. One must engage the forces of nature, the orishas, which the loa, the saints, etc. So these are all the different names in different frameworks for the same thing. That is, beings that may or may not be human, but have an existence outside of the realm of the visible. So whether it's Macumba, Santeria, Candomblé, Odun, Mayal, within those frameworks they refer to the Loa, the Orishas, the saints. So Ifa is the deity who was with Olodumare when the universe was formed. Eshu, Elegba, Elegua is the owner of roads and opportunities, also the crossroads, particular deity. So the Lord of Communication, and also can be shapeshift into being female too. Page 165, let us not engage the world hurriedly. Let us not grasp at the rope of wealth impatiently. That which should be treated with mature judgment. Let us not grasp at the rope of wealth impatiently, that which should be treated with mature judgment. Let us not deal with a state of anger. When we arrive at a cool place, let us rest fully. Let us give continuous attention to the future, and let us give deep consideration to the consequences of things because of our own eventual passing. An African version of the teachings of Don Juan, huh? Death is riding on your left shoulder. Pay attention to what has heart and meaning. Live as if it's your last day. So we talked about this before, and I'm just going to skip over it because we have done it before. Talk about chapter 11. That is in Asante. So African history is composed of one, he basically tells us one African tradition and two principal invasions. So overlays of European Christian traditions instead of the indigenous African Christian traditions, and Arab Islamic traditions have given Africa a complex cultural array of ideas. One came early and stayed late, that is the European Christian. The other came late and stayed late, that is the Arab Islamic tradition. So there is Islam before there are Arabs. And Islam, like its other Abrahamic cousins, came out of an African tradition. So for example, the previous slide where in Yoruba they talk about the rope of wealth. In the original Aramaic, when Yeshua is talking about how difficult it is for a rich person to enter heaven, as it's as easy as a camel jumping through the eye of the needle. Well, that's kind of wordplay because camel, the animal, and gamel is a rope. Right? And so, yes, a full-grown rope will be difficult to thread through the eye of the needle, but you can basically unravel the rope and send a single strand through the needle. And basically, this is the idea of the rope being kind of a burden. That is, wealth being a kind of a burden that you have to unravel and give away as a value around wealth. The idea being, okay, this is going to be an attachment. So great that you were able to accumulate it, but you can't take it with you. Pass it on, do a bunch of good before you pass on with it. So nevertheless, the Christian and Islamic influences changed the structure of African behavior and created new institutions that often competed with or replaced the ancient traditions. So for example, one country, Benin, remained predominantly dedicated to an African way of thinking. Other nations came too quickly, gave way to the religious traditions of other people, for example, again, Islamic Arabs and European versions of Christianity. That came with not only the European conquerors, but also other folks. Did I show you my pictures from Ganvier?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. On the coast?
And it's on a lake.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Different
So this is this androgynous balance of male and female. This statue basically was in Benin, Ganvier, which is a stilt city, a city built in the middle of a lake, because their tribal enemies had cultural prohibitions against being on or crossing water. So, and were basically predating on them for slaves. And because the large European slave ships, couldn't go into this lake, and this lake is like 2 to 3 meters, so in other words, 6 to 9 feet deep. You can't bring in a big warcraft there, and you can basically travel by canoes and stuff like that. So the idea of both this figure both having a penis, testicles, and breasts is one depiction of an actual reality, not just simply, shall we say, symbolic, but people could actually be born like that. The Vodun altar over the door of no return, I think we've seen already. So here's Ganvier. So this, they don't like people taking pictures of them. So people will often turn away, put their hands up, et cetera, but it is, a big tourist thing outside of Cotonou and Benin. So they travel around on, either paddling. So what he's got there is probably water, because, you can tell the color of the lake being a very dark brown or whatever. Though kids learn to swim in this particular village at a very early age, would make sense. This was a place that had not only a restaurant, but a hotel, as well as kind of like the tourist trappy, buy beads, buy cloth, buy this, that, and the other, as well as statuary. They make their living trapping fish. And the fish are basically, this is an inactive fish trap, but basically the fish get they swim in, they can't swim out, and then you can gather them once they're fully operational. There's a mosque built on one of the few places that you have dry land in the middle of the lake. Also a church. So I mean, when Asante is talking about Islam, Arab-based Islam and Christianity, which forms are we looking at here? And also not too far away, so you also have traditional African religion. This is a sacred forest in Benin, in Cotonou, outside of Cotonou, near where they've built a kind of monument of the door of no return. This is one of the Loa, or the Orishas, within this particular forest. And they believe that 300-400 years ago, a king lived in the forest and was transformed into one of the trees. That's still there, so still alive. That's yours truly, the base of one of these giant baobabs, where this isn't the tree that the king transformed into, but it's similar to the one that he did. Benin, also known as Dahomey, is also one of the places that fielded women warriors. So when in Audre Lorde's book, Sister Outsider, she quotes Herskovits, who basically talks about the Fawn of Dahomey, still practice 12 kinds of marriage in 1977. Dahomey is the old name. It's 20th century, but it's now called Benin. The Amazons, or Amazais, there was a detachment of Amazais who guarded Gaddafi. And so one of these 12 kinds of marriage, basically the basic value of these particular women warriors on screen left is bring back 2 heads or add your own to the pile, right? So notice she has a sword, knife, flintlock, musket, etc. And then on screen right, you have a detachment of Amazons who could be warrior wives of the king, who's the only male seated in this particular picture, and you can tell, okay, the women aiming a gun and all that, and facing the camera. So late 20th, late 19th century, roughly. So where Europe entered the long sleep of what he refers to as the White Ages, i.e. the Dark Ages. I don't know why, and he's basically doing a reframe here, because, as I've said, nobody else was dark, so don't blame our ignorance known elsewhere as the Dark Ages. The context being a construct of whiteness and white supremacy, of which America is currently the pinnacle, requires that you forget all other history, her story, our story, and their story, in favor of the story that creates and supports the society, which requires cultural self-abandonment, cultural amnesia, and uses divide and conquer strategies. So often, we were talking about this in my office earlier, one of my work studies is doing research on various prevention things, and he noticed children's stories, like in particular, his upbringing where, Rudyard Kipling, the Just So stories, and, I gave a quote from The Elephant's Child about, listen, O best beloved, the elephant's child with insatiable curiosity, or insatiable curiosity. I pointed out to him, and he wasn't aware of this, that Rudyard Kipling also wrote The White Man's Burden. And so, which he'd never heard of. And I go, yeah, so it's interesting that with Rudyard Kipling, Disney takes it over as The Jungle Book, Song of the South, again, African Trickster Tales, Brer Rabbit, The Tar Baby. You see these things as children, but you don't necessarily question the origins, the cultural underpinnings, or the meta message of them. So you start, getting colonialism and other certain values along with your mother's milk, or having your mother even read these things to you. So the White Ages, lasting from 500 to 1000 in the Common Era, the Arab subcontinent was slowly awakening until the appearance of Prophet Muhammad of Mecca. So again, there was Islam before Muhammad. Muhammad is just simply considered the last Rasul within that particular framework. That is, the last messenger of God within that particular framework. So basically, your imams essentially interpret the Quran in various ways. So Europe slept, covered by great sheets of ignorance, essentially off the stage of humanity since the massive fall of the Roman Empire, which had one time been thought impregnable. Islam rose to international stature on the wings of Quran and the sword of passionate warriors. The flight from Mecca to Medina and the return to Mecca in the 7th century gave Islam the strength it needed to promote itself as an international ideology. Now, when you think about international ideologies, and basically he makes the point at the top of the chapter about a European form of Christianity as well as Arab forms of Islam, we're American. So part of what makes us American is the ability to question stuff openly without necessarily getting bombed or shot or whatever. And if we need to oppose it. So there's thinking about that in the beginning, Islam was kind of like a upstart religion competing with other religious frameworks in the area. And what is it in itself that makes it an international ideology? That, i.e., relates to a lot of people. What would you think? And then, off the top of your head. Part of the obvious piece for me is the book. The Quran. Literacy. Okay? Plus, all the things that go with literacy, numeracy. Okay? So number, word, then art, architecture. So there are things that are influenced, and there are subtexts that are influenced by the word. So, for example, General El-Az, invited by Africans in Egypt to drive out the Romans in 639, meant that once the Romans were driven out, the Arabs would remain in the power vacuum left in the absence of Roman control. Now, military control isn't the only control. The Arabs would never leave, and soon Arabic was the language of the ruling elites, and Islam replaced both African religions and what forms of Christianity existed. Now, sometimes Islam and sometimes Christianity are tolerant of other religions, particularly when it doesn't affect their colonizing power, just like anybody, just like the Romans before them. Okay, so there's certain elements of, to become an international ideology, you have to want to become an international ideology and expect some kind of conformity to something that still makes practical sense. Yeah,
So the ideology was able to become international because it didn't rely on oral communication, it had written communication which could be spread further, faster
yes.
because of literacy.
And not so much further faster, but further and more permanent.
Oh, yeah.
More permanent than people's memories.
Because of the book.
Right, because of the book, right. Now, of course, you have to be able to question the book, too, and what the book is based on. I mean, that's one of the things in terms of, you know, our electronic books, not that Google's a book, not that Wikipedia is a book. I mean, it does cite sources, but sometimes those sources and the conclusions they make are questionable. But it's convenient, and so we confuse convenience with, you know, wisdom. Well, why should I read a dictionary? I'll just Google it. Well, there's a utility to reading and the ability to question. So the pattern established in Egypt would lead to a standard practice. In Arab-occupied Africa, Africans who were not Muslims, sometimes who were Muslims, would be abused, tortured, enslaved, and have their lands extorted. So, just pointing out that, I'm not doing a Bill Maher here, putting down all religions, but certainly religions do play a role in conquest. Like the Europeans to come, Arab invaders found African cultures too willing to fall under the spell of the magic of the book, rather than the traditions of their ancestors. So the book, because remember here, we're not necessarily dealing with printing presses, we're dealing with people who are writing. The magic of the book, rather than in the traditions of their ancestors. So the traditions of their ancestors, if they weren't people of the book, mean that the traditions would be oral and also subject to change faster. The Arabs and the Europeans used religion as the hook that got the African bait. When they came, we had the land and the gold, and they had the Bible. Afterwards, they had the land and the gold, and all we had was the Bible. I've actually heard that several different countries in Africa when I was there in 11, which could be just as easily said about the Quran, as well as given the Islamic respect for ancient centers of learning, like Timbuktu or Mali, or basically, you know, the recent smashing of, you know, of the museums in Mosul and stuff like that. So, African and American, to switch over to that. Al-Kabbalah in Africa is the source of our strength. Atlanta, Tulipitwapa, Kisinep. America is the test of our strength. In Africa, strength through self-knowledge, remembrance of humanity. American strength through creating unity through the knowledge of connection. I pledge allegiance to all my relations. Yeshua teaches me to love my enemies, and my enemies are those who cannot see themselves or me as their relative. Adversarial, anyway. When they act as if they are not kin, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So, this doesn't mean that you lay yourself down as a doormat or sacrifice, but you learn to keep yourself strong, building your courage. And if you place yourself in the path of the fist of the system, don't be surprised if you're knocked on your behind. The fist is predictable, so you don't have to remain in its path. This is kind of like a Bruce Lee Kung Fu thing. Bruce Lee Kung Fu thing. In Jeet Kune Do, don't be there when the fist arrives, but do understand and train yourself on its tactics. That is, fear, divide and rule tactics. Love and unite, empower. Or also Shishindi, surrender. So, Apache surrender. So Homeland Security fighting terrorism since 1492. That's Geronimo and I believe some of his nephews. The famous graphic. Shoshindi surrender. Geronimo once allowed himself to be captured by the U.S. Army to free his relatives in captivity. In English, surrender means to give up. And he used a word in his language which was translated as English as surrender, but in his language it means to give over. And you can only give over to something greater than yourself, and that only means creator in his language. It means I surrender to whatever happens as the will of creator of which I'm a part.
Acceptance.
Yeah, it's acceptance. So surrender is to give over to something greater than yourself. But of course, if you're dealing with the cavalry and you know that they're not greater than you, okay, I'm going to let you capture me, but I'm freeing my folks, or dying trying. And either way, it's a good day to die. So this is, part of actually it's a Yoruba worldview too. So we can definitely see in terms of universality that different cultural values often intersect and get replicated in interesting ways. So the word, incompletely translated as I give over, literally means in a short version, all is made beautiful. Apache itself is a Zuni word which means enemy. Tene, Shishindi, both mean the people, and that is their name for themselves. Of course, people will say, yeah, I'm Apache, because you might not know what a Tine or Shishindi is. Tine, cousins to the Dine, Navajo. But Apache has been genericized as the name of the nation. So Geronimo's battle tactics required a detailed knowledge of self and the land and deception through the enemy's belief in their superiority. So you can't just win by knowing what they do physically, you have to know how they think. And when we're talking about Yoruba divination and manipulation of n-dimensional forces, you have to be able to get into their head without being trapped by their thought. So that's not just African, that's also Apache. So, certain lessons from the ancestors. So, Alice Walker wrote a book, Now is the Time to Open Your Heart. In it, an ancestor who is killed by night riders, i.e. the precursor to the Ku Klux Klan, reveals an insight into white supremacy. They were curiously inept at creating entertainment for themselves that didn't center around us. I imagine that has not changed. He was describing his maiming, potential torture, and murder. So in this particular scene, she's having a dream, I think through ayahuasca, though she doesn't say that. Basically, the character in this book is a writer who's basically gone off to this journey in Peru, and they're by a jungle, and they have ayahuasca, and basically she has this dream about this meeting an ancestor, because I want to meet my ancestors, I don't know where I came from. And one of the ancestors, and she was basically freaked out by this particular ancestor who kept showing up in dreams, and he didn't have any teeth. And that was horrifying to her, like, okay, what is this guy with the no teeth thing? What is this? And so the shaman said, okay, well, you need to establish communication with that. So, here's an herb that'll help you have lucid dreams, and then you need to meet with this ancestor. And so this ancestor then spoke with her and said, okay, you're the first person of my genetic relatives, because remember that whole Yoruba thing about you reincarnate among your bloodline relatives, right? You're the first one of my relatives to actually not be afraid to talk to me. So, after pulling all his teeth out with pliers, Massa set him on the road for the night riders. Now, what had happened, and I should give, since I have read the book, he was describing his maiming potential torture and murder, which was basically part of the entertainment. So apparently, he was a field slave that was very good looking and had a smile. And Massa was really old and possibly getting impotent or whatever, and had a young wife. So one day on an errand, he was, in the big house, in her bedroom. She wasn't in there. And he saw himself in the mirror for the first time. And, what do? You kind of make faces and you smile, right? And, he had a big smile and lots of teeth and all that kind of stuff. And, he heard a sound at his back, and it was, Miss Ann, whoever. That's the stereotypical name from Uncle Tom's Cabin of a white woman, mistress of the house or whatever. And, long story short, predictably, they become lovers. But then Massa finds that out, and because he had a great smile, Massa pulls out his teeth and sets them on the road to basically, run, and then gets chased with the dogs and all that kind of stuff. So that's what prompted the comment about they're curiously inept at creating entertainment for themselves that didn't center around us. So, for example, in 12 Years a Slave, whippings and all that other kind of stuff. So after pulling out his teeth with pliers, Massa set him on the road for the night riders. The nigger running, the white fiends chasing, the sound of the dogs. They hated that I had been killed instantly. So what happened was he tripped and stumbled, and one of the guys shot him through the heart instantly, killing him. They hated that I'd been killed instantly. They hoped to have some fun with me. He was disappointed that he'd been robbed of torturing me. He wanted to have some fun with me. Oh, no, you shot him through the heart. As they stood there looking down at me, he turned on the man who had shot me and hit him. Right there, as I was dying, they began to fight. This is what I want you to remember. Not how painful having my teeth pulled out must have been. Right? Because it's a horrific story. We're going to focus on the horrific story. I don't understand. We are very old, our people. Not many could have suffered as we have and survived. We have had many lifetimes to learn of the many, many ways we do not wish to be. But we are human, she said, and therefore we already are every way there is. That is true, but there is still a lot of room for choice, which is why it is necessary to remain in touch with your ancestors. Did you realize ancestors have jobs? I didn't know that. Is there unemployment insurance? Our job is to remind you of ways you do not want to be, he said. Sometimes I think that message is the hardest to get across because it flies in the face of our need to have revenge. We feel we need to avenge, to make right, to heal by settling the score. Healing cannot be done by settling a score. The way to be is to remember your connections. So we've learned, for example, in this class, of pre-Columbian contact among the people of the four directions. So that the ancestors kind of gave us that construct about different peoples coming from different directions, but they're the same people, at least on the same planet. So I talk about, even though I'm wearing my Cuba jacket, one of the islands along with Cuba that has historically been involved with slave insurrections is Haiti, also known by various names as Santo Domingo, but now sharing the French colony and the former Spanish colony, sharing the same island And one of the principal figures from that, certainly in Black history, is Toussaint Louverture, who is celebrated in a rock song by Carlos Santana. Check it out. So Toussaint. François Dominique Toussaint Louverture was one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint was reputedly descended from the Western African Arada tribe. His father, Gao Guinou, had been brought from to Santo Domingo and sold to the Count de Breda. Toussaint was the eldest son, and his date of birth is given as either May 20th or November 1st, All Saints' Day. That's where in French, Toussaint means All Saints. So, Catholic, Christian. Also took the surname Breda from his owner. De Breda was relatively humane and happy as a master to encourage Toussaint to learn to read and write. Became a coachman of the Count and was already a noted horse rider and herbalist before his subsequent military and political career. So free black priest Pierre Baptiste taught him to read. He married a woman named Suzanne Simon, and they had a son named Placide. I'm going through this actually because other people pick up on this, notably Delaney and other folks that we'll be learning about in the Civil War, who named their sons after Toussaint Louverture and also his kids. Now, Toussaint, though it was not widely known during his lifetime, Toussaint was a free man by the time of the Great Slave Uprising. He would eventually help lead. He was freed from slavery at about the age of 33. Colonial records show that he leased a field of about 15 hectares with 13 slaves to grow coffee. So he goes from being a slave to a free man who owns slaves. So there is some interesting contradictions within this that we have to kind of wrap our minds around in terms, and one of the things that I like about Toussaint as an example is that you definitely have to know who your friends and your adversaries are, because you can be betrayed just as easily by your friends as by your adversaries. So a foolish associate is often more dangerous than a determined enemy. So the French Revolution of 1789 had a powerful impact on the island, inspired by the new philosophies of the Enlightenment, liberté, égalité, et fraternité, that is, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. The French proclaimed the rights of man to include all free men. When this promise was withdrawn under pressure from the plantation owners, it sparked widespread slave uprisings. So, for example, when we talked about Alexander Dumas and Alexander Dumas' father, so he was born here. And basically, very similar to Toussaint, Dumas and also the Chevalier de Saint-Georges were basically both mixed-raced Frenchmen who had white French fathers and black mothers who were slaves. And while they were on the island, they could enjoy a certain amount of freedom, particularly if their fathers were nobles, but they were still mixed-race people. Now, once they got to France, they were free, particularly after the Revolution, which basically said we're abolishing slavery, which didn't mean that they got rid of racism. It just meant that now the former slaves or the children of slave mothers, once they get to France, on French soil, are free as a result of the Revolution. So this kind of idea in France, which is the mother, and the colony, which is the child, naturally the child wants to be like the mama, right? Free. And so this is one of the things, especially when I reference Cuba. Cuba was like the same thing. Okay, we want to get rid of the Spanish. We want to be free, just like Mexico, just like other places. So Cuba has also been a hotbed of, kind of revolutionary stuff going back to the mid-19th century. But the French Revolution essentially had inspired all its colonies. Oh, well, let's be free too. So he did not participate, for example, in the campaign of Vincent Oge, who was a wealthy freeman of color. His attempt to claim voting rights for this group, freemen of color, in 1790 was brutally crushed. Now, the idea then is that people are born free and they want to exercise some of the rights of freedom, but under colonialism, they aren't often allowed to do that, even though the law may support that. It's very similar to what was happening here in the United States a little later. What happened in the United States a little later is, yes, black people won the vote in the 1865, 1870s, but we weren't allowed to vote because it's the states that determine who is eligible for voting. So we have the federal right to vote, but then we basically had segregation for another century in terms of the vote. So here's what's happening, same thing happening in Haiti, presaging what would happen in America. So Oge helped his former owners to flee to the USA and became an aide to George Biassou in his insurgency after the Night of Fire. So his former owners fleeing to the USA. So why the USA, not France? And more to the point, where in the USA? Would you think? Think about filet gumbo.
Louisiana.
Louisiana, which is named after the French King Louis, right? Which was a French colony. That's why the pirate went to live in Biloxi, because it was a French colony. Right? So this is a French colony. That's why are they going to live there rather than go to France? So he rose rapidly, and the Black Army proved to be surprisingly successful against the fever-ravaged and poorly led European troops. Fever because they're coming from temperate Europe and coming to tropical America, malaria, etc., not fun. 1793, Toussaint allied with the Spanish to fight against French troops and gained the nickname Louverture, the opening. Because he exploited openings in the defenses of the opposition, he adopted the moniker as his surname, Toussaint Louverture. Later that year, the British occupied most of the coastal settlements of Haiti, including Port-au-Prince, Léger, Félicité Sonnefax, and Étienne Porverel, representatives of the French Revolutionary government in Paris, offered freedom to slaves who would join them as they struggled to defeat white counter-revolutionaries and fight the foreign invaders in Haiti. So, largely Jacobin, revolutionary legislature in Paris ratified the Emancipation Orders that abolished slavery throughout all territories of France, of the French Republic, including all its colonies. Early in May, Toussaint left the Spanish and rejoined the French army, bringing thousands of black soldiers with him, and received the rank of brigadier general. Under his increasingly influential leadership, French army of black, mulatto, and white soldiers defeated the British and Spanish forces. His army won 7 battles in 1 week against the British forces in January, and he also fought against the rising of mulatto leader Pincinot. In 1797, he fought against the supporters of the returned Sonnefax. He increased his influence on the island, proclaiming his loyalty to the French Republic. Eventually, he was promoted to division general, and the British withdrew in 1798. In 1799, he signed a trading treaty with the British and the Americans. Later, he invaded Saint Domingue's southern peninsula and defeated the mulatto general André Rigaud, his last major rival for power in the colony, and forced Rigaud to flee to France. Then, Toussaint turned his forces against the Spanish in Santo Domingo, on the other side of the island, defeated them by 1800, and in January 1801 officially took control of Santo Domingo in the name of the French Republic. That is the entire island now of Haiti. He drafted a committee to write a constitution, which went into effect in 1801, July 7th, 1801, and also enforcing his own authority on the island. When Napoleon came to power in France, he began to work with colonists to return France's Caribbean territories to their earlier profitability and as plantation colonies. So understand how profitability works, and I feel, based on the experience of Dumas' father, Napoleon, we can basically certify Napoleon as a racist, a slaver, okay? So when the colonies are going to return to their former profitability, that means the only way, if what you're producing on the plantation is making the same price, to make more money, you have to pay people nothing, right? Rather than a fair wage, which reduces your profits. So, wait, we're free. We're basically trying to be free and productive, but Napoleon wants us to reinstate slavery after we just won our country back in the name of France, and France is turning on us because of a racist. Okay, let's do common sense. Oh, it's Napoleon. And Napoleon does not like, as with the case of Dumas' father, tall black men who are military geniuses, because he's a short, pale shrimp. Sorry to be ageist and heightist, but there we go. I don't like slavers. So denying he was trying to reinstate slavery, liar, Napoleon's brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, attempted to regain French control of the island. He landed in Santo Domingo and moved against Toussaint with troops. Over the following months, his troops fought against the French, but some of his officers defected to join Leclerc. Toussaint signed a treaty with the French on condition that there was no return to slavery and retired to his farm. After 3 weeks, Leclerc sent troops to seize him and his family and shipped them to France in a warship. They arrived in France, and he was imprisoned and died of pneumonia in captivity. So here's a French patriot, or at least a patriot from the point of view of freeing his island and eliminating slavery, and the mother country basically turns on him. And so in terms of a lesson to who's your friend, who's got your back, and who don't, Toussaint is a great example as an ancestor. Toussaint lesson. So the effort to subdue Toussaint led to France selling his North American territories to the Americans, and this is known as the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, trying to suppress freedom is costly, because, you have to raise money for troops, and the troops want to be paid. Toussaint didn't always make alliances based on race, nor were all people of color his allies. So, do not assume that just because somebody's white that they're a racist or your enemy. Do not assume that all people of color are allied with you. It ain't so. So note from the story, like, who is your ally and who's your enemy, and figure then why. That's why you have to know the history of your adversaries as well as your allies, so that they become predictable. He allies with France, fights for France, and France rewards his loyalty with betrayal. Yeah, so how does freedom, equality, and brotherhood apply to you? So, how will your allies betray or support you? So include that in your planning. Liberia. So the founding of Liberia represented the intersection of America's racial conflict and foreign policy. In 1816, a group of white Americans founded the American Colonization Society to deal with the problem of the growing number of free blacks by resettling them to Africa. Now, notice, wait, what's the problem with free blacks in America? Yeah.
Competition for jobs.
Competition for jobs, unless they start their own businesses, right? What else?
According to who?
Yeah, I know, right.
I was
So,
gonna say like they're uppity, or is that what you're
yeah,
talking
what
about?
is that? Wait, you're proving that, yeah, that it is the land of opportunity for everybody, and they're proving it, so that's a problem. Let's ship them back to Africa. Why is this a problem? Well, it is a problem, and notice who it is a problem with. So, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Randolph, and Fernando Fairfax were among the best-known members of the Colonization Society, and ex-president Tommy Jeff publicly supported the organization's goals, because we know how he feels about free black people. And President James Madison arranged public funding for society. So Liberia, as in liberté. So in 1818, the society sent 2 representatives to West Africa to find a suitable location, but they were unable to persuade local tribal leaders to sell territory. So why is that? Traditional Africans don't believe in real estate. You cannot sell what you didn't create. You didn't create the land. You can use it, you can kick it here, but you can never own it. We don't believe in that. You don't buy that. Right? So in 1820, 88 free black settlers and 3 society members, which I would assume from context means white folks, sailed for Sierra Leone. Before departing, they signed a constitution requiring that an agent of the society administer the settlement under U.S. laws, i.e. a colony. They found shelter in Cherbourg Island off the west coast of Africa, but many died there from malaria. Do not, if you ever go to Africa, do not neglect your malarials. People die from that stuff. Great place to go though, but get your shots, take your pills, watch your mosquito contact. 1821, a U.S. Navy vessel resumed the search for a place of permanent settlement in what is now Liberia. Accounts differ, but it's quite possible the threat of force caused the indigenous leaders to agree to sell a strip of land to the society. Now, this is also paralleling what would happen, for example, in Alaska. The Russians didn't make landfall at all, but they discovered Alaska. And the Tlingit Haida people, who had been living there for thousands of years, kind of made a dispute with the American warship that showed up to, oh, well, we just bought Alaska from the Russians. Can we build condos? No, not condos, but anyway. The American warship had to basically enforce the claim by force. The Cherbourg Island group moved to this new location, and other blacks from the United States joined them. They suffered attacks from the local tribes, and in 1824 had to build a fort. In that same year, the settlement was named Liberia, with its capital at Monrovia, named for President James Monroe, in case you didn't know that history. So it was basically a recent Ebola outbreak, which is how we heard about this in the news recently. Sierra Leone and Liberia. So other colonization societies sponsored by individual states purchased land and sent settlers to areas near Liberia. Africans removed from slave ships by the US Navy were also put ashore in Liberia. So in 1838, most of these settlements with up to 20,000 people combined into one organization. Now, note what's happening here. The Constitution protected slavery and imports of slavery into 1808. But 20 years later, you got US warships basically stopping slavers in the open ocean and bringing some of the captured slaves back to Africa. Since we don't know where you came from, hey, live in our colony. So today, about 5% of the population of Liberia is descended from these settlers who came from America as well as the displaced slaves. The American Colonization Society was not a sovereign state, and so when Great Britain and France began an encroachment on Liberian territory, it was hard-pressed to defend its interests. The United States government lent some diplomatic support, but wait, talking ain't guns. So this is not sufficient to fend off these military advances. So in 1847, Liberia declared independence. Britain was the first nation to extend recognition. The United States delayed recognition until 1862 because of fears of the impact this might have on the issue of slavery domestically and objections that some might have to the presence of black diplomats in Washington. Free black people in Washington. We used to be enslaved black people in Washington, and we can't have that. And a similar thing was also happening in Cuba, like 10 years earlier. So for that, in that context then, Congress banned the importation of slaves into the US after 1808. Slave importation, of course, continues illegally throughout the Civil War. The Wanderer, for example, one notorious slave ship referred to in the movie Daughters of the Dust. John Brown, and there are lots of different responses to slavery. So John Brown, as an anti-slavery activist, first holds an anti-slavery convention in Canada, attended by 12 whites and 34 blacks. The next year he attacks Harper's Ferry with 13 whites, 5 blacks, October of 1859. So the idea, what he was trying to do is basically raid a US military stockade, procure weapons, and basically start a slave rebellion. The Missouri Compromise, and also the Oregon Solution, for example. Missouri Compromise, March 3rd of 1820, prohibits slavery north of the southern boundary of Missouri, and Oregon, 20 some odd years later, simply prohibits all blacks as well as slavery as the solution to being free. Nat Turner, black slave and preacher, led the most famous slave revolt in the United States. In 1831, he and 60 to 70 others revolted, killed about 60 whites in Virginia. The victims included the family of Joseph Travis, his owner. Turner was born on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. His parents and grandmother encouraged him to become educated, read and write, and to fight slavery. There is that connection, reading and writing, fighting slavery. The son of one of his masters taught him to read and write, and he became known as a forceful preacher who believed that God wanted him to free the slaves. This conviction led to his planning the rebellion. So a black slave and preacher led the most famous revolt. And this is, on the right, is a handbill basically looking for his death. In 1822, Denmark Vesey organized a slave revolt involving thousands of blacks in Charleston. Was betrayed by a house slave. 37 blacks were hanged. So that tension between the house slave and the field slaves was real. Alexander Lucius Twilight, probably the first black to graduate from an American college with an associate baccalaureate at Middlebury College in 1823. Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper, published in 1827. Slavery was abolished in that state, New York, July 4th. There is a line from the Hosea, which is Egyptian writings, which talks about be skilled in speech. And I use that to caption David Walker's appeal. So I mentioned David Walker last week but here's the text of his appeal. From the Hosea. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a person is a sword, and effective speech is stronger than all fighting. I call upon the professing Christian. I call upon the philanthropist. I call upon the very tyrant himself to show me a page of history, others either sacred or profane, on which a verse can be found which maintains that the Egyptians heaped the insupportable insult upon the children of Israel by telling them that they were not of the human family. Can the whites deny this charge? Have they not, after having reduced us to the deplorable conditions of slaves under their feet, held us up as descending originality from the tribes of monkeys or orang-utans? Oh my God, I appeal to every man of feeling. Is this not insupportable? Is it not heaping the most gross insult upon our miseries, because they have got us under their feet and we cannot help ourselves? Oh, pity us, we pray thee. Lord Jesus, Master, has Mr. Jefferson declared to the world that we are inferior to the whites, both in the endowment of our bodies and our minds? It is indeed surprising that a man of such great learning, combined with such excellent natural parts, should speak so of a set of men in chains. I do not know to what to compare it to, unless, like putting one wild deer in an iron cage, where it will be secured, and hold another by the side of the same. Then let it go, and expect the one in the cage to run as fast as the one at liberty. So far, my brethren, were the Egyptians from heaping those insults upon their slaves, that Pharaoh's daughter took Moses, a son of Israel, for her own, as will appear in by the following. So David Walker's appeal was probably the most radical of all anti-slavery documents, at least at the time. Caused a great stir when it was published in 1829 with its call for slaves to revolt against their masters. So when we're talking about responses to slavery, just like the Jews against Hitler did fight all the time, but you wouldn't expect the Nazis really to advertise that that's going on. There's all kinds of revolts against slavery and all kinds of responses in terms of the peaceful abolitionists to people, white people even, like John Brown, basically saying, no, the only way to end this evil is to kill the slavers. Sorry, turn the other cheek? No. So, David Walker wrote, they want us for their slaves and think nothing of murdering us. Therefore, if there is an attempt made by us, kill or be killed, and believe this, it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. Whoa. Even the outspoken William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, objected to Walker's approach in an editorial about the appeal. So again, when these debates, when we talk about the fact that slavery has returned to the United States, And it is an economic fact, and I'm not just using hyperbole. So that slavery has returned to the United States. So, what about an abolition movement for those forms of slavery, when the slavers are not, in fact, individual families, but multinationals and or cartels or international criminal organizations? How do we stop that? So the goal of David Walker's appeal was to instill pride in its black readers and give hope that change would someday come. It spoke out against colonization, which was, of course, a popular movement that sought to move free blacks to a colony in Africa. In America, Walker believed that belonged to all who helped build it. And he went further, stating, America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. He then asked, will they drive us from our property and homes, which we have earned with our blood? So copies of the appeal were discovered in Savannah, Georgia, within weeks of its publication. Within several months, copies were found from Virginia to Louisiana. That's going viral in the 19th century. And Walker revised his appeal. He died in August of 1830, shortly after publishing the third edition. So his object was nothing short of essentially revolutionary for the time. He would arouse slaves in the South into rebelling against their master. His tool would be his own pamphlet, his appeal, a document that's described as, for a brief and terrifying moment, the most notorious document in America. So the son of a slave father and a free black mother, David Walker was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. Interesting place, Wilmington. In 1796 or 1797, in accordance with existing laws, since his mother was a free black, David Walker was also free. This freedom did not shield him from witnessing firsthand the degradation and injustices of slavery. He witnessed much misery in his youth, including one disturbing episode of a son who was forced to whip his mother until she died. He traveled throughout the country, eventually settling in Boston, but even in the free northern city with its prevalent discrimination, life was less than ideal for its black residents. Still, he apparently fared well setting up a used clothing store during the 1820s. In Boston, he began to associate with prominent black activists. He joined institutions that denounced slavery in the South and discrimination in the North. He became involved with the nation's first African-American newspaper, the Freedom's Journal, out of New York City, to which he frequently contributed. And by the end of 1828, he became Boston's leading spokesman against slavery. In 1929, he published his appeal. To reach his primary audience, the enslaved men and women of the South, he relied on sailors and ship's officers sympathetic to the cause who could transfer the pamphlets to southern ports. He often employed his used clothing business, which, being located close to the waterfront, served sailors who bought clothing for upcoming voyages. He sewed a copy of his pamphlet into the lining of sailors' clothing. Once the pamphlets reached the South, they could be distributed throughout the region. Very clever. Walker also sought the aid of various contacts in the South who were also sympathetic to the cause. So, one thing that I draw from this is covert networks, but don't assume that your covert networks are going to remain covert if you use electronic medium. The appeal made great impression in the South, I guess it would, in both slaves and slaveholders. To the slaves, the words were inspiring and instilled a sense of pride and hope. Horrified whites, on the other hand, initiated laws that forbade blacks to learn to read and banned the distribution of anti-slavery literature. So, yeah, that would make sense, too. They offered a $3,000 reward for Walker's head and $10,000 to anyone who would bring him to the South alive. Friends, concerned about his safety, implored him to flee to Canada. He responded that he would stand his ground. Well, that's a good way of standing your ground, I'd say. Somebody must die in this cause, he added. I may be doomed to the stake and to the fire or to the scaffold tree, but it's not in me to falter if I can promote the work of emancipation. A devout Christian, he believed that abolition was a glorious and heavenly cause. And he published his third edition of the Appeal in June of 1830. 2 months later, he was found dead in his home. Although there was no evidence supporting the allegation, many believed that he had been poisoned. Later, scholarship suggested he died of tuberculosis, the same disease that killed his daughter. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can die suddenly from tuberculosis with no other signs, though. I think I'd go with the poisoning. So, revolts against slavery, Walker's Appeal. So we already had talked about the first black college graduate, and then Macon B. Allen, the first black lawyer. Frederick Douglass, I think we've actually seen this already, right? Yeah. Yes, and Sumner. Yes, we had left off here, the Civil War. Hannibal Guards, the Crispus Attucks Guards of Albany, Revolutionary War, yeah. With the Civil War, Lincoln and company first refused, and Lincoln before and after the war met with a group of black leaders. I think I have this somewhere. Yeah. One of my favorite enemies, Forrest Gump's namesake, founded the Ku Klux Klan. As a commanding officer, before founding the Klan, he oversaw the massacre at Fort Pillow. In case this appears on a final near you, along with the Crispus Attucks and Hannibal Guards. Fort Pillow. Remember Fort Pillow. The Texans want to remember the Alamo, you should remember Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow, a force of black soldiers and civilians, black women and children, and soldiers were burned and buried alive after they surrendered, at the order of the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. So, think of it as a mass lynching carried out on American soil by armed forces in time of war. So, To Make Our World Anew, Gabriel Prosser, his wife Nanny, brothers Martin and Solomon were in a slaveholder's nightmare, the ultimate in uppity. Uppity, of course, means you don't know your place. That is, you attempted to educate yourself and consider yourself equal. Any attempt to act as an equal gave you the label uppity. Their plan, was not just to free themselves, but free all slaves in Virginia, make Virginia a black homeland for all those people unfit for slavery, which basically be all those people. Prosser attempted to incite a revolt of all slaves in Virginia, capture an arsenal near Richmond, and then lead a revolt against the city, and then create a free state. A storm washed out all access to the city, delaying the attack, and the conspiracy was betrayed. Again, by a black person. So we've seen, for example, where Virginia becomes the model for not only the creation of whiteness, but also the responses against it, and the corresponding disempowerment of people of color, as well as women, as well as their acting in their own empowerment. So rebellion, of course, wouldn't have been bloodless. Even if armed, you'd be facing the United States Army as well as state militias. Then, even if you had succeeded, you'd still have to feed people, have an economy, trade, have sovereignty, and sovereignty means you can stand up on your own against physical attack, and you have your own language, customs, history, economy, which you can also defend. So When we're talking about revolution, when we're talking about, for example, transfer this to ISIS, the Islamic State, there's still going to have to be people to run the garbage service and run the sewer. You can't just rule people by fear. You also can't force people, to grow food. Food has to be grown, and you have to have money, et cetera, to do all the things that require you to be civilized. So it's a difficult proposition to unite slaves, because if all you have giving you a common bond is oppression, you can unite around freedom, but that by itself, eventually you get freedom, but then what? What do you do with it? How do you organize around that? I mean, it's very similar with, for example, suppose the Palestinians got the West Bank. Well, if their identity is against Israel, that's not for nationhood. Having a common oppressor and uniting against that oppressor is not the same as unity. It's not. We've seen that time and time again. So we kind of need to become a people if you're in this kind of situation. So in the meantime, economics, sell the people what they need, and they need clothing. So cotton, like the old advertisement, the look and feel of cotton, the fabric of our lives. So slaves who might have been set free by debt and conscience-ridden Chesapeake planters were instead sold to the planters of the cotton-growing states of the lower South. Slaves were property, and just like any usable object could be sold to a booming economy. So, for example, no one has a copy of To Make Our World Anew yet? Here? No? Okay. So, this, on page 174, the Negro in his own country. So that graphic is basically a black person in grass skirts in the bush, basically sitting down uncivilized. And the Negro in America is where a black family is wearing Western-style clothes and being preached to by a white preacher. So basically the idea is that religion is a tool, as we talked about at the top of the broadcast, where it doesn't matter whether it's a European form of Christianity or the Arab form of Islam. Basically, both have been used as tools of conquest, which is not to say all religions will be used as tools of conquest, but I actually have noted when I actually said that the Aramaic-speaking Christians have never been involved in war, where under the influence of ISIS, to fight against ISIS, they are now. There are Aramaic militias in Syria fighting against ISIS. So I guess better that than extermination. Page 191 in Kelly et al., The Fugitive Song. So the vagabond in the Fugitive Song, that makes a reference. A vagabond is somebody who has no permanent place to live and wanders from place to place. Somebody who survives by asking for food or money, and to wander from place to place. So a vagabond is like, we would refer to them as homeless now, or we used to refer to them as hobos from the Civil War. Ho boys, people basically wandering around with a agricultural implement, a hoe, not the whore. Okay, agricultural implement, H-O-E, looking for itinerant work with a bundle of their clothing in it. So, in the beginning, the reason I'm starting with this is when we start looking at the concept, which is not popular and is not believed by the official sources, that is the American Psychological Association. But there are a group of mental health practitioners of color and white who, in an alliance very similar to the abolition movement, as well as John Brown, etc., basically have decided to characterize racism as a mental illness. Now, as an addictions practitioner, I would say that it's a co-occurring disorder. That is, it's both an addiction and a mental illness. So just like crack makes you crazy, just like meth-induced psychosis, the concept, the meme of white supremacy, basically cuts your connections to other people by setting yourself in a delusory superiority, and then the power that you get becomes addicting by itself. So basically, in some of the conceptions of, okay, well, what's the mental illness part? Well, it's like schizophrenia. It's like denial, projection, confusion of being unable to determine what's real. So, for example, in the literature that focuses on the development of racism and racial attitudes indicate that children can be infected with that particular meme as early as age 4. And as early as age 4, white children had already internalized feelings of superiority. The preference for being white and negative attitudes towards blacks were found not to be as a result of direct contact with blacks, but as a result of subtle communications from parents, teachers, the media, and so on. These are studies that go back into the 60s and 70s.
It's all true.
The preference for the color white and negative connotations about the color black were found not only in very young white children, but also transferred over to black children as well. So whether one accepts racism as a mental illness or not, how one handles racism is a major health factor affecting not only black mental and physical, spiritual health and economic health, but others as well. So I mentioned this, but I don't know that I had quoted this section of it. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call into question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just. So, actually, I think Obama should read Frederick Douglass, not Lincoln. Ain't I a woman? Now, here's the context of this. This is Sojourner Truth, who was speaking at a convention of early 19th century feminists. Then the feminist issue was not about birth control, it was about voting, citizenship. And Sojourner was speaking, or trying to get into this, mostly women event, and they didn't believe that she was female. So they made her bare her breasts. Women, white women did. And then she basically commenced with this speech. Ain't I a woman? 1851, the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. They didn't want to admit her because black women didn't speak out, so they made her take off her shirt to prove she had breasts. Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, that is, do better. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What is it they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says that women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. And you said it well. So we'll close here around 2 minutes ago. So history is that story told to explain the present and the future, and often beginning not only with scripture in a religious context, but also what gets written down as history. So part of what we've been talking about is looking at the issue of slavery, the responses to it, whether it means going back to Africa, whether it means taking over a state in the United States, or Lincoln wanting us to be shipped off to Costa Rica, whatever those solutions are, making a way out of no way here in America. All those things are on the table as options, and we'll continue more on Wednesday. Till then, roll music.